Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Bully of Skidmore, Part 10. This is the story of Ken Rex McElroy. When we last left off, we were talking about how Sheriff Marshal David Dunbar had put a manhunt out for Ken Rex McElroy for the shooting of Ernest Bo Bowmankamp at his store on July 8th, 1980. And Officer Dean Stratton, who had ran into Ken McElroy many years ago and knew just how McElroy was whenever he was questioned about anything. And he was the actual officer that McElroy had actually pulled a gun on when he was just joining the force in Skidmore. And on an inkling in Skidmore, Dean Stratton would actually have a theory that Ken McElroy was trying to avoid being arrested and figured that he would either flee to either Nebraska or Kansas, and he would take the fastest route to Kansas. And sure enough, Ken Rex McElroy was seen pulling into Kansas with his wife Trina, and that is when a chase ensued. And Stratton would actually call for backup, and knowing that Ken McElroy was listening to every single word they were saying, he would even say, "McElroy, you need to pull over," and he would also tell backup to be ready for him because he was armed and extremely dangerous. And McElroy, being afraid of it being a complete gunfight, he pulled over to where Stratton would walk up, and he would walk into the truck and tell McElroy that he needed to get out of the truck. And McElroy would simply ask him, "What am I being arrested for?" And Stratton would say, "You're being arrested for the shooting of Ernest Bo Bowmankamp." To where McElroy would very arrogantly ask, "Where was this at?" And Stratton would kind of just roll his eyes and say, "Skidmore." And McElroy would say, "I haven't been in Skidmore." And looking upon in the truck, there were no guns inside the truck, just him and Trina. And at this point, they arrested Ken McElroy for assaulting Bo Bowmankamp with a deadly weapon. They would take Ken McElroy into custody and question him at the police station. And almost immediately, he would go and tell the police, as he done before, "I don't know anything. I never shot anybody. I want to talk to my lawyer." And Ken's lawyer, McFadden, would actually talk to authorities and have him be released on a $30,000 bond. And shortly after being released, he would be caught in another altercation where Ken McElroy had pulled a weapon on this couple. And shortly after that altercation, they finally put it to where Ken McElroy was not allowed to own any kind of weapons. He could not have a weapon in his truck. He could not carry a weapon. And honestly, this should have been implemented many, many years ago. And it's kind of surprising it took him this long for the courts to finally say, "You know what? You can't even own a weapon." And the courts would actually let McElroy walk free on bond after that altercation under the premise that he would actually behave himself. But we both knew he would not behave himself. But the next night after McElroy had been arrested for the shooting of Ernest Bowmankamp, he would actually walk into the tavern. And might I also add, they set his trial date for that shooting on August 18th, 1980. And so he would walk into Greg Clemens' tavern, that he had done so many times before, right after being arrested for shooting him, and he would very arrogantly look at Greg and the other patrons in the bar and say, "Well, what happened the other night? Did the grocery store get robbed or something?" The people of Skidmore would often say that Ken McElroy's arrogance knew no bounds. And it is also at this time, as they were nearing the trial, that not only Ken McElroy, but other people in his family, like Trina and his daughters, would regularly threaten any supporter of the Bowmankamps, and would call these different businesses and would call them every single day and say, if you testify against Ken McElroy, something very bad is going to happen to you. Or they would call and tell them, if you testify against Ken McElroy, we will kill your whole family. Or they would even call and say, if you testify against the McElroys, we will burn your whole house to the ground. And not only were different patrons of Skidmore, but it was also people like the 4 boys that Ken had paid to walk into the tavern, and including Marshal David Dunbar. And because Ken could not carry a weapon in his truck, one particular night he would drive over to Greg's tavern, and Trina would follow behind his truck in her truck, and they would approach in the tavern and they would look around, and McElroy would look at Trina and just say, "Go fetch your rifle out of the truck." And she would go out into her truck and she would bring out this M1 Grand rifle that actually had a bayonet attached at the end of it. And she would hand it to Ken, and Ken would take the rifle, pop the clip out, pop it back in, and just show it around everybody in the bar. And he would look at Greg and tell them, "This is the gun I'm going to kill Ernest Bo Bowmankamp with." And it is at this point that Ken would just walk completely out of the bar and go home. It is also said right after this event that they had had enough as far as the people of Skidmore. So after McElroy had made this threat, 4 or 5 men in that tavern would actually go home, arm themselves, and go sit out and wait in the driving lot of the grocery store of the Bowmankamps, and a couple more would actually stay watch at the Bowmankamps' house. And it is at this point that the people of Skidmore were getting tired of McElroy's antics, and many people were saying that they were just completely done. Most people in Skidmore would even make references that if they even saw Ken McElroy walking alone in a dark alley, they would make it look like an accident. And McElroy knew this, and this kind of made him grow increasingly paranoid, to the point that he would actually tell his family what to do in the event that something would happen to him. Shortly after this incident, Greg Clement would actually talk to another tavern owner, Pete Ward, about the statement that McElroy made. And Pete Royd, who was also an ex-military person who did time serving in the Army, would look at Greg and say, "If I ever see that man with a rifle, I'll blow him away." And Pete Ward would actually be the person that many would say kind of kick-started this whole event. And shortly after the conversation with Greg, he would actually call the courts and would suggest, is there anything they could do about this whole problem with McElroy? And a little side note about this, during this time, the trial that McElroy had for the shooting of Ernest Bowmankamp had happened prior to this incident with Pete Ward. The trial would actually happen around June of 1980, and they would actually find Ken Rex McElroy guilty of shooting Ernest Bo Bowmankamp, and they would sentence him to about 6 years, but they would allow him about 25 days to 30 days in order to get his affairs in order. June 18th, 1981. Sorry about that. And around this time, after the trial, he would go into Greg Clement's bar and actually threaten to shoot Bo Bowmankamp. And it is at this time that Pete Ward started getting a petition. And he would gather everybody that Ken had robbed and everybody that he had harassed, including retired Sheriff Marshal David Dunbar. And they would have a petition hearing around July 10th, 1981. But McFadden was a very fast worker, and he had stretched the trial out for a later date. And by the time that the people of Skidmore came to the courts to have this petition, they realized that it had been stretched to a later date. So therefore, Pete Ward would take everyone that arrived for the petition and have a town hall meeting in Skidmore. And there they would talk about what they planned with Ken Rex McElroy.